And the idea that adults have always said that kids these days are soft, there's some truth to that. Every generation thinks the one after it is soft. And especially those generations who've lived through hardship, they are tougher. And they were successful, and they made a better world for their kids. So yeah, their kids are softer. I'm a lot softer than my parents were, and they're softer than their parents were. So part of that is just modernity and progress and rising wealth. You certainly can't blame the kids for that. Now, is that all it is? Is that all it is? No, because how do you make anyone strong? How do you make any kid tough? Only by letting them out, letting them have adventures, letting them have misadventures, letting them get lost and frightened, and then they figure out their way home. Maybe they ask someone for directions and they find their way home. And then they learn, hey, I can go out. And even if I get lost, I know how to deal with that. So yes, kids these days are much softer, but it certainly isn't their fault. It's the overprotection side. So we have only ourselves to blame for the overprotection and for the softness. Then you add on to that, because the overprotection began really in the 90s heavily. But mental health didn't decline in the 90s, and it didn't decline in the 2000s. So the millennials, and I guess you're sort of borderline. You're Gen X.
I know, it's so depressing. I was born in February of 1980, so it's like, everyone's like, you're Gen X, right, and I'm like, well, okay.
No, you're right on the border, just as I'm right on the border of I'm technically a baby boomer, but I'm 1963, so it was like the second to last year. So no, we're both at the very end of our generations.
Gotcha.
But the point is that Gen X actually had the worst mental health of any generation in a long time. They had high rates of depression, anxiety, and certainly suicide, actually, was the big one. And there's other reasons for that, I think, involving leaded gas, which is an interesting story, but we'll leave that one aside. In any case, my point is that the mental health of teenagers was not declining in the 90s and 2000s. It was actually getting a little better. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose in the early 2010s. So that's the period that I call the great rewiring of childhood. Because in 2010, only about 20% of American teens, less than that, had a smartphone. The iPhone comes out in 2007, but most teens don't have one in 2010. By 2015, the great majority do. And it's not just the smartphone. It's a smartphone with high-speed internet, which wasn't as common in 2010, with a front-facing camera, which comes out in 2010, with Instagram, which comes out in 2010. So the life. So as a kid's going through puberty, imagine a 13-year-old girl going through puberty, in the late 2000s, 2007, 8, 9. She's on a flip phone communicating with her friends. There's not much social media. I mean, she could do Facebook on her dad's computer in the living room if she wanted to, but she can't be on Facebook 9 hours a day. It's just not possible. So one of the reasons we freaked out in the 90s and started locking up our kids, not letting them outside, is we were afraid not just of kidnapping, but of sexual predators. And some of those stories were real. There were some institutions, the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church. There were places where there was sexual predation, and it was covered up, and that was horrible. So there was some real stuff, and there was also a lot of fake stuff that wasn't real. Like daycares were not sexually molesting 4-year-olds. That just was not happening.
The satanic panic you're referring to?
Exactly. Yeah. That was all. That's exactly. That was all nonsense. That was all. So my point is, there were some sexual predators, and I shouldn't minimize that. I mean, they're still around there out now, but we freaked out about it in the 90s. And what we're learning now, the Wall Street Journal has been covering this, is that the sexual predators, they've moved largely onto Instagram and a few other platforms because it's really dangerous to try to stalk a kid on a playground. I mean, you could end up in jail.
Yeah.
Just go on Instagram where you can if you approach 1,000 little girls, one of them will send you a sprinkler photo.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and then that's the one who doesn't have parental supervision because she was able to take a sprinkler photo of herself and send it to you, and nobody was like, "What are you doing? Yep. Why are you taking a photo of yourself when you're outside in your bathing suit? You're 9 years old." That's the victim that you go for, and it's really terrifying. I've told this story on the show a zillion times, so I won't go into detail here. But back in the 90s when I was on AOL, I wanted to meet women, and one of the guys at work, I worked with a bunch of adults in Detroit at a security company. I was like the web guy and a driver, and they were like, you should make an account on AOL or whatever as a girl. You'll see what all the guys are saying, and then you'll be able to stand out. And I was like, this is genius. And what happened instead, sure, I got a little like, hey, what's up? And I was like, okay, just don't start with, hey, what's up? And you're going to stand out. But what I also got was, and this is a 15-year-old girl, like you could make AOL say like, I'm 15 and I live in Troy, Michigan or whatever. And all these older guys were sending like you couldn't really send photos or anything, but they would send creepy messages. They would send like, here's a bunch of dashes and an @ symbol. This is a rose for you. And I was like, what is this? So I printed it out and I took it to work and I said, look at these losers hitting on this girl who's 14. This guy's 38. And my boss was like, hey, I know you think this is a laugh. This guy's actually a predator. We need to call the FBI. So the FBI, they had relations with the FBI Detroit office. And I remember them being like, whoa, this is not just like a funny thing happening to you on AOL. We need to get these guys. And the guys really were looking, they were looking for people who had poor parental supervision on, especially as far as the internet. And one of the ways that we were able to get this guy, one of the guys arrested, was I told him that I was going on vacation with my family to Toledo, Ohio, which is just across the border, state line in Michigan.
Oh,
so
wow.
To bring FBI jurisdiction into play, because they were having trouble figuring out, because AOL's like HQ's in Virginia, but the server was in Southfield, Michigan, and I was like, they were just like, how do we handle this? So they were like, we need federal jurisdiction. Here's how we do it. So lured that guy, and his whole thing was, oh, your family's taking you on vacation, but your parents are going out all day without you. Let's do a photo shoot in my hotel in Toledo at the same time. This guy was a really, he planned it out. This was like a, what's that guy, Chris Hansen or whatever, where he's like, have a seat right there. You came over for this. It was really that very thing. But they were counting on that. It wasn't like, I'll pick you up and talk to your parents and I'll convince them that this is okay. It was like, tell me when your parents are going to be gone. And you know, only now that I'm older do I fully compute really what this, how kind of like targeted this really was.
So was this guy, was he put in jail? Like, did this lead to a...
He was arrested, but I don't know much more beyond that. I would assume by the time you're getting arrested by local authorities with the FBI right there that you are in trouble, because, you know, federal prosecutors have a pretty good conviction rate. And I had reams of chat transcripts from this guy, emails, DMs, they were called instant messages.
Good for you for taking that risk and just dealing with this guy. Wow, you really did a public service. Because each of these guys is reaching out to hundreds or thousands of girls, and there are, who knows how many, but I'm sure it's thousands or tens of thousands of these guys. So again, it's, we have overprotected our children in the real world. We've underprotected them online. Both were mistakes. We've got to undo that.
You mentioned another terrifying phenomenon in the book, which is mental illness almost being contagious via social media. I know that's not quite the right terminology, but I'd love to know. You mentioned Tourette's was one of the examples.
Sure. Yeah. So especially as teens are, one of the things teens are really wrestling with is identity. You don't think about your identity when you're 6 and 7 years old, but that's one of the developmental challenges. I mean, Erik Erikson in his stages of development, it was teens' identity is one of the tasks. So who am I? And the internet connects you, and I shouldn't say the internet. The internet overall is wonderful. Social media in particular can put you into communities that are about identity. And this is where Tumblr actually becomes quite important. I didn't know this when I was writing the book. I've learned it since. Facebook and most of the platforms connect you based on who you know and who they know. It's a social network. Tumblr connected kids around a common interest. So a rock band, a sport, a hobby, and over time, a mental illness. So you'd have a common group around depression or anxiety or eating disorders. So now you're really talking and sharing with people who have a common interest in a particular mental illness. And we know that emotions are contagious. That's very, very clear. This is older work by Nicholas Christakis and James Fowler, that when you look at networks of adults, if one adult gets depressed, their friends are at slightly increased risk of depression. Yeah. And amazingly, their friends are at slightly increased risk of depression. So happiness, sadness, these all spread through social networks, and they spread more from women than from men. That is, women share more, they're more open about their emotions, and they're more receptive, they're more open and empathic. So girls and women are just much more vulnerable to stuff traveling through social networks once you super connect people in the early 2010s. And so I think that's one of the reasons why self-harm, anxiety, and depression all have this hockey stick shape. When in 2010, when they weren't on Instagram or other platforms, it wasn't spreading like wildfire. And by 2015, they were all connected. And so if you're if you've got algorithms picking out the most extreme, the most successful posts, well, those are from the most extreme people. So, so this is thought to be one reason why there was such an upturn in anxiety and depression, anxiety disorders, depression. TikTok Tourette's is the most interesting one. That kids, especially girls, were coming out with what looked kind of like Tourette's syndrome. But with Tourette's syndrome, people will sometimes shout out something. They'll make all kinds of jerking movements, but they're distinctive to them. They're not copying each other. One person will shout out a particular word. And in this case, because a young English woman was shouting out the word beans, and she was a very popular influencer on this TikTok Tourette's, it wasn't called that, but on this interest group on TikTok. Girls all over the world were starting to copy her, including shouting out the word beans. So it wasn't real TikTok. It wasn't real Tourette's, but it actually was a movement disorder. They would jerk and twitch. They weren't faking it. They were susceptible to it.
Interesting.
So it's, people say, oh, it's so great that social media allows people to connect with people over mental health issues. I mean, yeah, if you had groups run by psychiatrists, I think that would be pretty good. But if they're run by other people who are competing to get followers, I don't think that's a good thing.